What we've seen the last few weeks, however, from other countries is a sort of message to America. President Trump being very, Trumpian about NATO, about his old friendships in Europe, saying he doesn't need Europe, doesn't like NATO, rude about Canada, talking about invading Greenland, even talking about invading Canada at one point. And so you've seen Mark Carney say quite explicitly that, China's a more reliable partner than America at the moment. Now, Britain is not taking that position. I think that's fairly clear. And I think Starmer, in his briefings, has made it clear, or Downing Street in their briefings have made it clear that this is not part of that move, that this is not an alternative to America. And Starmer himself, of course, has, although he was forced to criticize Trump last week over the comments about, NATO soldiers not really fighting in Afghanistan, he's tried to maintain good relations with Trump.
Let's start with that trip then. And as I mentioned, our political editor, Anna Mikhailova, is on the plane with the Prime Minister, and she sent us this voice note.
I'm about to board the plane to Beijing with Keir Starmer, where he will be the first British Prime Minister since 2018 to visit China. And he's planning to use this visit to signal quite strongly that the UK must start to engage with China. He's going to say that the UK has been blowing hot and cold for too long, from golden age to ice age with Beijing, and that, like it or not, China matters.
Well, the Times China correspondent Richard Spencer is already in Beijing and joins us now. Richard, hello.
Good afternoon from here. Good morning to you.
Tell us then, from China's perspective, what would make this, it's a fairly lengthy visit, what would make this visit a success?
I think for the most important thing for China is that it's happening at all. China, like most countries, likes to be liked. And for the last 6 or 7 years, Britain hasn't liked China. There was this golden era, as you and indeed Sir Keir Starmer said back a decade ago, when David Cameron and George Osborne were running the shop. And then there was a sort of frost, particularly under Liz Truss, who didn't like China and said we shouldn't deal with it. And ministerial visits stopped. And China found that quite offensive. So they like the idea of having a slightly more normal relationship with ministerial visits and so on. On the ground, one of the interesting things, if you look at the sort of the graphs on things like trade, it doesn't seem to make much difference whether Britain's prime ministers say we're in a golden age or an ice age. It just sort of trots along at the same pace.
There have been several more ministerial visits, haven't there, in the last few months, whether that's the Chancellor going, the Business Secretary, and also quite a lot of recent visits as well from other European leaders and Canadian leaders. Tell us how maybe the mood has shifted over the last 18 months or so.
Yeah, so I think we have to thread this quite carefully because this Starmer visit comes very much from his initiative when he became Prime Minister. He identified foreign policy as one area where he was going to take a slightly more pragmatic and, as he would put it, more consistent approach than the previous Conservative government. And one of those things was to re-establish a relationship of sorts with China, as he says, a pragmatic relationship. We don't know what pragmatic means. I'm never quite sure what it means in pragmatic terms. But anyway, he said it was going to be a pragmatic relationship, rather than that what was undoubtedly a sort of inconsistent policy over the 14 years of Conservative rule. So he's been working up to this visit. And as you say, he very early on sent David Lammy when he was Foreign Secretary. Then Rachel Reeves came a year ago, the Chancellor, and all with a view to eventually having a visit himself to meet President Xi when the time was right for both sides. I mean, I think China wanted various issues sorted out first, like the embassy. What we've seen the last few weeks, however, from other countries is a sort of message to America, President Trump being very, Trumpian about NATO, about his old friendships in Europe, saying he doesn't need Europe, doesn't like NATO, rude about Canada, talking about invading Greenland, even talking about invading Canada at one point. And so you've seen Mark Carney say quite explicitly that, China's a more reliable partner than America at the moment. Now, Britain is not taking that position. I think that's fairly clear, and I think Starmer, in his briefings, has made it clear, or Downing Street in their briefings have made it clear that this is not part of that move. That this is not an alternative to America. And Starmer himself, of course, has, although he was forced to criticise Trump last week over the comments about NATO soldiers not really fighting in Afghanistan, he's tried to maintain good relations with Trump.
Yeah. It's going to be fascinating to see exactly the sort of the dynamics, how the meetings go, then also how the press conferences go. What there will be lots of Starmer's colleagues looking for is to what extent the Prime Minister feels able to mention serious issues and concerns over things like human rights, spying, the detention of Jimmy Lai. How difficult do you think it's going to be for the Prime Minister, who has said he would raise challenging issues where interests and values differ?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be the party pooper, but I think people looking for messages out of the public meetings, the public side of the meetings, looking for something to take away about the nature of Chinese attitudes to Britain and British attitudes to China, will probably come away disappointed. China runs its diplomatic engagements according to very tightly scripted formulae, and you won't see President Xi ever or any of his prime minister or other ministers talking off the cuff or changing their script because of what's been said in a meeting, unless Starmer does himself go off script and say something that they find particularly offensive, and I don't think he'll do that. I think it's clear he will raise the case of Jimmy Lai. He's raised the case of Jimmy Lai before when he met President Xi on the sidelines of a summit in November 2024. He raised the Lai case then. Since then, Jimmy Lai has been convicted. He's waiting sentencing. I think that would be quite an important part of the visit, and I think that the Chinese will have been pre-prepared that Starmer will raise that, and they will accept that will be raised, because otherwise the visit wouldn't be allowed to happen if Starmer was going to raise a case and they said no, you can't. So I think that's been accepted, that some of these issues will be raised, and President Xi will bat them off. Whether something is going on behind the scenes in terms of particularly the Jimmy Lai case, in terms of what happens to him after he is sentenced, that's another matter, and that's something I'm going to be looking out for quite closely over the coming weeks. But I doubt that will happen now, because he hasn't yet been sentenced, and Beijing is going to allow the process in Hong Kong to reach its natural conclusion.
It's so useful, Richard, to understand how you are going to be looking at how to read the room for us to be able to sort of get a better understanding. And for context, in case you weren't familiar, Jimmy Lai is this sort of British Hong Kong pro-democracy media tycoon who's currently detained in China. Final thing, Richard, the Prime Minister is going with business, cultural leaders, as well as sort of loads of journalists. So we've got representatives from HSBC, the pharmaceutical company, JSK, Jaguar Land Rover, National Theatre. What does it tell us really about the kind of priorities in terms of a closening relationship and closer trade ties too?
So my interpretation of this is that unlike, as say, Liz Truss, who was very suspicious of expert comment generally as a prime minister, and I think she was very suspicious of particularly the core, rather small core in Britain of people who work in China, work on China issues at the Foreign Office. She had an almost semi-public row with the the then British ambassador, the last British ambassador, Caroline Wilson, when she was trade secretary, about relationships with China. What this looks to me is a return to a much more traditional way of engaging with China, which is the way that over the years people who know China have advised governments to deal with China. China works according to the common view, according to relationships, and according to a sort of broad attitude rather than one-on-one deals in the kind of Western sense. I mean, if you want to do a deal with a Chinese business, it's not just about getting on the phone, getting face to face with an executive and shaking hands. It has to be. It's a lot harder work than that. And the conventional approach has always been that for Britain to do deals with China, you need to sort of have a sort of much more broader attitude of building relationships over time, building cultural relationship, building exchanges on all levels. And so that's what the Prime Minister is doing. He's bringing out a lot of businessmen to shake hands, to get to know people, to reforge some of those relationships that haven't really been working in the last few years. Now, if we're expecting that to turn into a massive trade bonanza, I mean, that again is a different matter. I mean, I think that's a long-term goal that Britain can keep those relationships going. But at the moment, China is on a localization drive. It wants to make everything and do everything itself. So it's looking to sort of turn away from Western suppliers of things like, pharmaceuticals, for example. That's one of the big areas where Britain does do business with China, and where GSK and AstraZeneca are our two big drugs companies, have a big presence in China. But at the moment, China's trying to sort of make its own drugs, and so things like that's going to be, it's quite tricky, I think. But again, something to look out for. I mean, if China wants to say thank you to Starmer for coming and giving the face aspects of doing business together, President Xi might want to say something nice about sort of ensuring that British drugs companies have a role in China.
We'll see. Richard, thank you. Richard Spencer, the Times correspondent in Beijing.